Hello and welcome to the Business Post podcast. I'm Aaron Logan, sitting in for Danny McConnell.
And I am Peter O'Dwyer, as per usual.
And it's sort of fitting that I'm sitting in this week, given that back in 2007 I packed my philosophy degree into my bindle and tramped off to the GPO to work for An Post, which is the organisation led by this week's guest. Even then, I think I could tell it was a sprawling organisation, not just in terms of its geographic footprint, obviously, but in the services it offered, its connection to different parts of the state. I mean, I was a clerk sitting behind the counter, and I was selling stamps. I was paying social protection payments. I was accepting passport documents. All of this stuff that the post office offers, and it's a node, I think, or certainly was at that stage, a node between the public and several arms of the state. It sort of functioned as a catch-all office. And I think when you're speaking to David McRedmond, this week's guest, he showed you that it's moved on a lot since then.
Yeah, massively. And first of all, I'd imagine that you pine for those days quite a lot now in your current role, but that might be a counselling service that's best saved for later. Yeah, so An Post has completely transformed under David McRedmond. It still is that, as you say, node between the public and the state in a lot of ways, but it's also now that connection between the public and all the major retailers, the online retailers, and that really has been his transformation. I mean, in terms of its traditional business, mail volumes, postal volumes are continuing to decline. One of his big wins very early on with An Post was to scrap the price cap and to hike the cost of stamps, which we've seen repeatedly. But it's a little bit like the printed newspaper. You know, that's just kind of keeping us in the game for a while. It's about changing the nature of the game. And I think An Post has really done that. So like its mail volumes are through the roof. Its parcel volumes rather are through the roof. He mentions it's the likes of Shein, it's Amazon, it's the big online retailers that are kind of their future. And to such a point that they're now running out of warehouse space. That's where their logistical challenges are mostly, but that's the future of it. And I think his legacy at An Post is really that.
Yeah, because maybe it's a bit longer than I'd like to think that I was there, 2007, 2008. But it's transformed massively since then. And you can see that, or you can hear that in the way he talks about it, that he's talking about e-commerce being the biggest disruptor to the way we live in Ireland, really. And they've managed to gain a foothold in that when there was a lot of sort of purely commercial operators who could have squeezed them out. They've kept that foothold.
Yeah, so you can see, I mean, this job is very much about logistics, and he mentions that, but his own background...
He pulls you up when you say you spent the last few years in mail. He says, no, logistics. And I think that is an important point.
It is.
You know, the name is An Post. Yeah. Even with my very, very poor Irish, I know what that means. But they don't do a lot of post as it would be considered. They do a lot of e-commerce. They do a lot of much wider logistics that I think is much more crucial to the way every private business runs than people give it credit for.
Yeah, and you can see, I mean, he had stints at WH Smith, at Waterstones. He was a retailer before he was in the logistics/postal business. And you can see that background shining through in how he has tried to reorientate the business and do so successfully. And as well as what we've mentioned on the parcel side, there's also the financial services side. Now, that in some ways probably isn't as developed as he would have liked when he's actually leaving. They don't have the standalone mortgage products, for instance, but they do provide services on behalf of some of the pillar banks. And so that's another reason people have to walk through the physical post office now that wouldn't really have existed when you were working there.
Yeah, and even he was saying that there's a younger generation of customers coming in to avail of services like Vinted.
Yeah.
You know, it is a hub of activity that it can seem like quite a sleepy organisation or an old organisation in old buildings in sort of on the high street or wherever it is. But actually it's part of the e-commerce sector very, very much.
And he sees it as much as like a tech business and an AI business and, you know, right at the kind of cutting edge of data insights and all that kind of stuff, which when you're in the logistics game is obviously pretty crucial. So I think McRedmond, in fairness to him, has left quite the legacy at An Post. He didn't really want to go there in terms of like being too negative about his predecessors or what he kind of inherited. But I think any objective view of An Post from when he walked through the door to when he left now can only be seen as a real success story, in fairness to him.
Yeah, and we'll touch on it in the post-match analysis as well. But he's a legacy builder, and I don't mean that in the sort of the egotistical sense. He does want to change the Republic, and he talks about that. He talks about the Dublin Task Force, which I think the listeners will be very interested in. You pull him up a bit on his enthusiasm, I suppose, for the sale of the Carlton Cinema site from Hammerson to the state. I thought that was interesting.
I wasn't necessarily convinced by the arguments that he mounted that it was going to be better in public ownership than in private ownership. I did spring the question on him. Maybe if he had more time to think about it, there'd be a more compelling argument that was there. As I said to him in the interview, as people will hear, my initial reaction was, oh, the state has bought this landmark site. They're going to put a landmark piece of transport infrastructure through it and presumably put residential, whatever, around it. All sounds great. But Hammerson's plan also had residential, it had retail, it had cultural space, it had that kind of mixed use that you would think is good for an O'Connell Street. They couldn't get it done. Their whole raison d'etre is to build these things. As I said to him, I read in, I think it was the RTE report, we're going to have another master plan now, supposedly, where TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, are going to meet with his task force to draw up another plan, even though we're 2 years on from the task force plan being out. So that to me all smacks a little bit of not much progress going to be made over the next while.
Yeah, but I do think that between McRedmond and Robert Watt, who's touched on in the interview as well, there's two people who are willing to expend political capital, bang heads together and get stuff done with that. So
you would hope so.
I was going to say they'll need to.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like this is something that's got great momentum behind it from all arms of the state to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think another interesting aspect of the interview is he talks about the next stage of his own career that he's done as executive roles, and I think the listeners will be interested in that. And before we go to the interview, I'd ask listeners to listen out for. You mentioned that his father was the editor of the Irish Independent, and you can hear McRedmond writing headlines at some stages during the interview, not just with what he says, but he pulls you up on the use of certain words. He says he doesn't like the word coordination. He likes the word leadership. You wouldn't get coordination in a headline, but you might get leadership.
Yeah.
And he says he doesn't like a few other words, including male, being used about it. So listen in for that, and here's the interview with David McRedmond.
David McRedmond, former chief executive of An Post and TV3 and many other things in a long and distinguished career. Welcome to the Business Post podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
You have now finished up with An Post. You're out the door.
I am.
What are you doing with your days other than talking to me?
Well, when I say I'm finished up, I have 2 weeks left, but I am preparing for, really what's next. I've already started 1 or 2 roles. I will be doing a number of boards, which I'm delighted to be on. And it will be, classic kind of portfolio career. I'm at that stage. The main focus of what I'll be doing, I won't be able to say until September, October. But I'm pretty excited. It's funny leaving, I've worked full time since the age of 23, really. So it's going to be different.
And it will be that portfolio of directorships rather than you're not going to go for another big executive role.
I'm not going for an executive role. I think I've varied interests and I'd like to really carry them. And I also think that there's a point at which, CEO is what I do. CEO is the job that I've learned. I finally have become, I can say it now, I finally became a good CEO in the end, but it takes a long time. But, it's definitely time for others. And I don't want to take up roles that would be important for others to do. And I think I hope I can provide some kind of leadership in a different way.
Were you undecided until recently as to whether you would try and get another big exec role or do the portfolio of directorships?
No, I was pretty much always clear. And partly, when you work in public service, and while in most terms it seems like good pay, it's, I can make more money. And I'd be very honest about that. And this is a good time to do it. I have another 5 or 10 years of good career time ahead of me. And it's time to really do something else.
You're joining the board of Irish Life Assurance as a board member, is that right?
Yeah, I'm on the board of Irish Life Assurance. I'm on an advisory board in EY. I've another board, which, as I say, I'll talk about in due course, which will be, probably more intensive work. And I'm also chairing the Dublin City Task Force Implementation Group. So that's probably enough. I might do one more in London because I spend a lot of my time there and I like being there and I've a place there.
Okay.
And I also think it's important, if you can't get an outside perspective on this country, we can be insular, and it's good. It's good to get a sense of perspective.
We'll get onto the task force because there's a lot to be spoken about there. In terms of, it seems like the directorships that you've already taken, they're not necessarily like your main background is obviously mail now in the last 10 years or so, but retail and I suppose an interest in media as well and a background in media from TV3. So they're not necessarily mapping onto your key sectors that you had as an executive.
I think, look, I'll describe my career very clearly as a journeyman. I've been in I think 5 different sectors. I've been in retailing. I've been in airport development. I've been in telecoms. I've been in media, and now in logistics. So, I think what interests me, if you take something like Irish Life, what interests me is not so much the activity, the precise activity of the company, but what the company stands for. And it stands for a really major institution in Ireland. And there aren't that many major institutions. And I really, really like what they do and what they stand for. I think when the great stories, and often the best stories don't get noticed, but one of the great stories in Dublin in the past few years has been Irish Life's decision to stay in Abbey Street, to completely refurbish, almost rebuild that magnificent headquarters, which was for many years the only really kind of modern corporate building in Dublin, beautifully refurbished, and a real commitment to Dublin One. So you see in every company there's a purpose and a meaning, and it's not necessarily the activity, although as it happens, insurance is really the bedrock of most businesses, because it's the means by which businesses can trade, can take risk, and can do things that they need to do. So it gives you a good insight into Ireland. Likewise, EY has had a phenomenal track record recently, and is growing very rapidly. And again, you get a good insight into Irish business. And so I like that. I like knowing where impact can be made and what is going on. That's where I like to be.
You mentioned a time in your career when you were in aviation, and you mentioned as well there's not so many big institutions in the country. One of them is the DAA. Has anybody sounded you out for that job?
No, they haven't. When I say they haven't, 1 or 2 people have suggested it, but no, nobody's called me about it. But no, I don't. Look, the DAA is a sister company to An Post and to, it's a semi-state organisation. I think it's a fantastic organisation. And I think it's, like all these public sector organisations, faces real challenges. They're really difficult organisations. But in general, the organisations are focused on what we could say in An Post. Our focus is for the common good. And I think they are for the common good. And I think DAA has developed well, but I'm sure they'll find somebody excellent too.
If they were interested in you, it wouldn't be enough to change tack on going down the directorships route?
No.
It wouldn't be an offer you couldn't refuse, no?
No. I've done my executive jobs. I've done my CEO jobs. I think if you go into a role like that, you really need to be, although they're fixed terms, 7-year terms, you really need to be looking at 10 years, because it takes 10 years to deliver a strategy. You can't do it overnight. Any job I've been in for typically 7 to 10 years. I think you need to give the time to it, and there's a certain rhythm to how that develops and works through. No, it deserves that. But look, DAA has some excellent management. They've done really well, I think. They've had their controversies, unfortunately, but they've also delivered. I'm amazed going through Dublin Airport that it really is streets ahead of any other airport in Europe in terms of getting through security and getting to your plane, which is the basic thing of an airport, And if the planes can be there, if they can take off on time, then that's an airport doing its job. All the ancillary stuff, and what I was involved in was WH Smith Retail, travel retail, which I set up, but was also, when it was in the United States, was an airport development company, a bit like Air Rienta International.
Okay.
That's all ancillary. I mean, yes, it's the commercial model, but semi-state companies should not be overly focused on the commercial model. There's a reason they're semi-state. There's a reason they're in national ownership, and that's because they have to deliver a public service. And the role of Dublin Airport is the public service, the connectivity of Ireland to the rest of the world as an island. And I think it does its job extremely well. And I think, but like any infrastructure in Ireland, it's underinvested, underdeveloped, and that's just something that we all need to come to terms with and understand that we're only halfway through building our republic. I'm fed up when people talk about republicanism as meaning nationalism in the north. It's not. Republicanism is the desire to build a place for people to live and work and play. And we're only halfway, we're a young country, and we've got a lot to do to build out our infrastructure.
And I mean, a big part of that is the task force, the Dublin City Centre task force. You chaired that, produced the report. Now you're you're leading the implementation group on it. They've appointed Robert Watt, and I've heard you say it's an excellent appointment. I think a lot of people would agree. Am I right in saying that report was published in October 24, Cabinet backed it in June 25. We're now in July 26. Outside of Robert Watt being appointed, has anything of note happened? It seems like quite a slow process again.
Yeah, I think a lot has happened, but yes, it is a slow process. Government moves slowly, and moves too slowly. We deliver the report in record time because there was real urgency. And then it just takes too long. And that's something that I know government is aware of and we need to look at.
And is it your job and Robert's job to push that now in this context?
No, it's Robert's. Oh, let me be very clear. It's Robert's job. I'm non-executive. Robert Watt is the leader. He's the leader of the task force implementation. He is the leader of the development of the city centre. And we've just come back from London. I was with Robert in London and a team meeting the Oxford Street Development Corporation, which is a very similar body just set up in the UK. And a fantastic, fantastic couple of days to see the different ways in which areas can be regenerated, how to rethink retailing, for example, how to rethink living in a city. So has much happened? Well, there were 10, big moves for Dublin in that task force report. And there has been a lot of good development. I mean, I actually think that we are on an upward trajectory now. I think you're seeing some positive changes. What we're not seeing yet is that all those changes are pulled into something greater, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the ultimate role of the task force of this group, of Robert and his team, to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. But there's endless number of projects going on because the 10 moves, they weren't 10 ideas for Dublin. Anybody can come up with that. What they were commitments by agencies to do things. Now, is the traffic plan working? It's partly working, but we need to do more. Is the Is the work around living, improving social housing? No, and that needs to get going pretty fast. Is the work around dealing with dereliction, living above the shop, is that beginning to happen? Yes. There's a really good work underway in terms of a pilot, North Frederick Street and Middle Abbey Street. That work has begun. I think the major news, and it was huge news last week, was the acquisition of the Hammerson site, which what's known as the Carlton Street site, which has plagued the city centre, plagued O'Connell Street. And if that can be developed into high-density residential, that will change O'Connell Street way more than anything else.
So convince me that it's better that site is in state ownership than in Hammerson's hands. I mean, they had excellent plans for the site as well. They couldn't get it done. There was planning disputes. Why is it going to be A, any easier for the state? And B, why is the state's plan going to be any better than Hammerson's?
So I think Hammerson are primarily a retail developer, shopping centre developer, and a very good one. And they've done an excellent job, for example, with Dundrum. And they've also now acquired the Irish Life Share in the ILAC Centre. So they will get on with their plans to develop retailing. The state ownership, and I can't say because I'm not involved in it. I'm aware of it. It's been acquired by Transport Infrastructure for Ireland. Obviously, the metro station is pretty important, being built underneath it. But I've no doubt that will involve private development, and I'm sure that will happen. The important thing is to get it moving and get it happening. Now, we all know the reasons for the slow planning, the constant judicial reviews, the complaints, and we know that all those things need to be solved. I think they are being gradually, but again, too slowly, so I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution. I'm saying that it's a big step forward, though.
I mean, when I first saw the news, I kind of felt positive about it. Big mega site, hasn't been developed, good that it's in state ownership, we get the metro, all of that, all what you said. I haven't really seen anybody convince me that the question I just asked you, that it's actually better in state hands.
Well,
than
if you look at something
ones.
like, so we were just in, as I said, we were in Oxford Street looking at development there. If you look at the Elizabeth line and their cross rail link and the stations they've built, and if you look at the station they've built at Tottenham Court Road, it's really backing onto Tottenham Court Road. That station has been built for residential above it, and it's phenomenal, and it's doing amazingly, and that is what will happen and what can happen. So the issue for me is how quickly can it happen. That's probably the real question.
The other bit then that worried me was I saw TII saying they'd now interact with your group, the Task Force Implementation Group, to draw up a master plan. I kind of thought we had the plan. Are we going back to have another plan now?
Well, I think you need a specific plan for the site. What specifically is going to be done? So you have to work that out. But that's not, this is not difficult stuff. It's not huge stuff. It's I'm well aware of, there was one developer who's got a plan for Dublin and for Páirc Dublin, and I asked what's been the political reaction. Said a senior politician said it was, felt it was too ambitious. And I asked this developer, how does it compare with what you've done in London? He goes, it's minuscule.
Yeah.
We've got to stop seeing these things as huge. It's one site, build it out, build 1,000 apartments, or about 800 apartments, however many will fit in. Keep it aside, keep a portion of it aside for essential workers and get other people in there. But that's just an example. I mean, we need high density residential, but we also need to convert above the shop so we get people living and the light shines down in the street. So, yeah, and in London, they were there with us. TII were with us actually in London in that group. So no, there's working together. There's no bureaucracy there. It's get on with it.
So if that's more likely to be high density residential at the Carlton site, does that then shift the possibility for the GPO site? Should that be something other than residential, or do you think it's better to have 2 mega residential developments?
Well, I don't know. And again, neither of these are up to me. And I'm just guessing that Carton high density residential might be something else, but I think that makes most sense. The GPO is iconic public building. And I think it's got to have some public use, whatever that is. Now, it's out for consultation. The Office of Public Works are launching a consultation. I hope that's a really public and noisy debate. Because we should all agree, what should this great building be? It's got to be rebuilt, most of it. And I think it's an opportunity for, I've advocated separately, not as part of the task force, for a great museum of the Irish nation, because we don't have something like that in Dublin. We've good museums, but they're smaller or they're archival. But I'm thinking of something like the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., or Yad Vashem near Jerusalem, which really they're either a place of commemoration, which is the Yad Vashem, or the African American, which is telling the story of a nation, of the African American nation. And they become places of pilgrimage and living places, living, breathing. They're not dying museums. And they're places that change constantly, but are a focal point. But, there's a million other uses. It could be for, other things that have been mooted, not by me, but somebody said move the Abbey Theatre. That's always been a plan. Should the Abbey be there? There's always been a plan. Thought about that. There's thought about, well, could you move... when the art school's there, could you do something that I think it's important that whatever is there, that it has as close to 24-hour usage as possible, because that's important.
Yeah.
So I think that's exciting, but let's get on with it.
And so in terms of where the task force role starts and finishes, I mean, presumably it's for government and the OPW ultimately to decide the use of it. Like, where does the task force come in terms of, is it just another interested party that submits its suggestion?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think the task force at the moment is in an interim stage pending the formal kind of establishment of the special purpose vehicle. And I think it will be more, the task force may be more about coordination. I don't like that word coordination. I much prefer the word leadership. If you can provide leadership, you need certain powers, and the task force needs planning powers. It needs other powers, but it can provide leadership by being very public and by involving the public and stating what needs to be done and working with experts and particularly working with urbanists. I think it's very important we bring in people from other cities and other countries, because there are great examples, and bring them in and really be a centre of great expertise.
So when will it be up and running fully with all those powers that it needs?
Probably from the end of this year, I would imagine.
End of this year, okay. And Robert is in situ at the moment and working evidently if you're on trips with him.
Yeah.
Has he or ye met with government yet to say, here's our plan to implement this?
I think meet with government all the time. I mean, I think there's, the nature of that is a constant engagement particularly with the Department of Taoiseach, because it's the Taoiseach is the sponsor of this, but also, obviously Department of Housing, and very much so with the City Council. This group is set up under the City Council at the moment. So, so that's how it's working.
Okay. Conscious we need to talk about An Post, given it is the focus of your career for the last number of years. What's your biggest success? I mean, we know about the evolution of it from more postal to now a parcel business, or largely a parcel business. What would you consider to be your greatest success in the role?
The greatest success is that this is a growth company again. That is what any company needs to be. If you're not in growth, you're not going to succeed. And we have, in the first 6 months of this year, we have 13% growth. Now, that's high growth for a company that's as old and as established as An Post. And particularly when, letter volumes continue to decline, that's inexorable. It's always going to happen. But, we put in place a strategy that said we will offset the decline in mail by price increases. I make no apology for it. It's a fixed cost network. Whether I deliver you 3 letters or 1 letter, it costs the same to me, but I'm only getting a third of the revenue. But we've done that so that we can invest and grow our parcel business and get to the point where the growth in parcels exceeds the decline in mail. And that's happened last year. And we're now seeing that parcel growth is now, the main driver of An Post for much of the past 15, 20 years was mail decline. The main driver of it, the economics now, is parcel growth, or what I'd like to call trading growth. It's e-commerce. It's not, this isn't moms sending parcels to people. This is a fundamental shift in how we live and work and play in our world. And e-commerce is one of the 2 or 3 really seismic shifts. It's as big a shift, currently a bigger shift than AI. And we're obsessed with AI, but it is fundamentally changing our world. And it's massive credit to the team at An Post, to all the works at An Post, that we've made that transition in many ways better than most of our peer companies in Europe. So we're now growing rapidly and we are profitable. That to me is the success. That's what we had to do. We're not very profitable, we're marginally profitable, but that's all we should be. As I keep saying, as I said earlier, we're a public service. And that's our job, is to provide a great public service. And I think in Ireland, I'm proud that people have as good or better a service than anybody has in Europe in terms of their ability to get e-commerce. And remember, we're an island. It makes it a lot more difficult. So that to me is a success. I think that is because we've a relentless focus, or my focus is always on relevance. Are we relevant? In any job, is your company relevant? It's the quote I often use from Jack Welch: if the world outside is changing faster than your world inside, you're becoming irrelevant. Relevance is the key. An Post is now systemically important to this country in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. It is systemically important. And I'm not sure that government has quite caught up with that yet, or others, in fact. But I think they are catching up with it now. If we stop deliveries, our ports will seize up pretty quickly, probably in a week. We move a phenomenal amount of goods. We're moving 2 to 3 million parcels a week. That's
phenomenal growth. Yeah. Is the next stage of that evolution that the universal service obligation, which I think you're on record saying shouldn't be in place, does that have to go now? Is that the next stage of the evolution?
Yeah, well, I think it's a stage of a societal revolution. It's not An Post. It's the EU is currently writing what it's called the Delivery Act, and that will decide the future of the USO. And I think, given that it's gone in most countries, when I say gone, it's largely been ignored.
Yeah,
I think the EU will lighten it considerably, and then it will probably go here. Now we will. It's up to the. I'm leaving, but it will be up to the next management. But I think we'll always have next day mail. But it's just how you shift that, how you change it. And there's a lot of things that you do around it. But you don't want to be bound by a whole load of obligations that are outdated and not relevant to people. It's quite a, and also this is now quite a competitive marketplace. If we don't do it, somebody else will do it. So I think, I think there's that. The other thing that's happening at the moment, which is extraordinary, is I'm just noting it for our AGM, is our post office network, for the first time in years, is growing again. Its volumes are up 10% year on year. And large.
Do you mean the number of branches or the volume going through the branches?
The volume going through the branches.
Okay.
Largely driven by e-commerce again, by the marketplaces. I think I can name Vinted. And that brings a whole new cohort of people into the post offices, but also agency banking now that the banks have withdrawn from towns. We're the only place where you can do your banking in person.
Yeah.
And by our own financial services. So, you know, I'm really pleased that, you know, we call it the green light strategy. I'm really, you know, we've developed it over a number of years. This is the second iteration, and I'm really pleased that that's delivering. But there are massive challenges around capacity. So our issue before, you know, was we were losing trade and losing volume and losing all that. Our issue now is potentially overtrading with the capacity we have. And we have to build out our infrastructure. And that's slow because government processes are really slow and unnecessary, because it's, in my view, because it's actually, it doesn't require any money from government. It's An Post investing its own money. But we need to build out our infrastructure pretty fast if we're not going to just seize up.
So is that the biggest challenge? If Fergalimi is named
Yeah.
as your successor, former Quilcha and Glendimplex, he'd be well known to people. Is that his biggest challenge going in now, to make sure that infrastructure gets built, or is there something else that's even bigger again, do you think?
Well, I certainly think that's a massive challenge. I think a big challenge, that's a massive challenge. Build out the infrastructure, build a super site that we've got planned. I think also, though, you know, the issues of world trade are really, you know, they are complicated. The new tariff regime has been introduced by the EU. So far, it's a relatively limited impact during the first couple of weeks, but who knows what impact that will have. Who knows, you know, the thing about trade wars is there's always a response. And what's that response, and how does that change things? I think there's a leadership position that An Post can provide in Europe in terms of where do postal organisations go from now? Because actually the postal network is a really vital global low friction network, and that's the idea of it. But that runs counter to trade wars, which are all about creating friction, whether it's with price tariffs or with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy often being the more difficult part of it. So I think that's really interesting territory to navigate, and somebody of Fergal's experience and depth of knowledge and international experience will be fantastic to look at that. And I think there's no shortage of issues. I mean, all companies, and I always say this, all companies are dying. You have to find the next strategy. Now, we've got a strategy which is high growth for the next few years, but you then need to have another strategy and another strategy, and you know that has to be found. The future has to be found.
Does he have fewer problems in his in-trade than you did when you took the role?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think I think there's one or two things that benefit. I mean, I had to get the price cap removed, and that was pretty bloody. In my engagement with government, it was very tough. But getting that price cap removed was absolutely vital to the future of An Post and to the economic model. So certain barriers are gone, but no, there's new problems. You know, there's a point at which, you know, price has been an important part of the strategy. That reaches a certain limit, particularly as mail volumes become less and less. So it's a different type of challenge. There are different type of challenges, but I would say that there's a great confidence in An Post and a great competence. You know, one of the things which I think is really notable about An Post now is we are a technology leader. You know, we're a leader in terms of data, in terms of digital, in terms of creating the systems that allow global flows of trade, etc. I think that's a fantastic competence we have. And, you know, there's really unbelievably good management, not just at the top, but coming through the system. So there's plenty of good there. But as with all of these things, you know, it's more about the world outside. How's the world outside changing? And, you know, we're in much more volatile times than we were 10 years ago.
It's been widely reported that An Post had sought an increase in the salary to 300,000 for your successor, and that the minister supposedly knocked that back, and 270 is where it's going to lie. Is 270 a fair salary for that job?
Salary is a funny thing, in that, to an awful lot of people that seems like a very big salary. If you're a CEO and you look at CEO salaries, it's a very small salary for a CEO role. Whether that's fair or not is not for me to say. People will judge, what's fair, what's right, what's wrong.
But just given your understanding of the role.
No, but what I would say is it's not about my understanding. It's about, that's why you have to look at these things professionally, objectively, and get the expertise. Government appointed a body to do that, to look at semi-state CEO pay. That body took its time to report, but it did report. It reported very thoroughly last year. And it reported last year, and it made a recommendation. And its recommendations were based on measuring the different size and complexity, etc., of the different companies. And An Post would be one of the largest and more complex. And it recommended a salary of up to 375,000. So that was the recommendation. That was the government's recommendation, and it was sponsored by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform and by Minister Chambers. That was it. So there should be no surprise that there's an expectation that the salary should be around that. And the fact that it isn't is, look, I understand ministers have jobs to do and things like that, but there just seemed to be the whole purpose of putting that body in place was to get away from any kind of subjective view around something and move towards something that has a very strong professional basis, which was there. And I think it's a pity government hasn't followed that consistently, so some semi-states have got very big increases.
Yeah.
Some haven't got, and in my case, get none. I don't think that's a good way to do things. But look, that's what it is. I mean, as regards, is it a fair salary for the job? That's an impossible thing to say, because it's very difficult to say any job. Why should a nurse be paid less? Why should somebody be paid more? But that is the world we live in, and that's why you need that kind of professional approach rather than just going, well, I think it should be X.
So, I mean, they appear to have shirked the decision due to optics? So if that's the case, if their own report suggested 375, I think you said, are we going to have a brain drain from semi-states at the top level if these increases aren't implemented?
I don't know. I mean, I think, look, that was the purpose of the body, was to make sure that, to meet the objectives of the future of semi-states. So if you follow their logic, yes, it would mean it will be more difficult to attract people into these jobs, people with the appropriate talent and expertise. As it happens, An Post has attracted somebody very good.
Mm-hmm.
An Post, I should also say, had excellent, and I mean really excellent internal candidates, really excellent. But there's no guarantee of that in the future, and there's no, and you also have to, there's degrees of respect in jobs, and there's degrees of how people value their roles. And so it's not just about, well, are you given enough money so you attract somebody?
I want to talk just very briefly as we come towards the end about media. Your father was editor of the Irish Independent for a couple of years, Louis McRedmond. You therefore carried on that tradition and agree with TV3. You clearly have an interest in it. Are you as interested still in the world of media as you previously were? What are your thoughts about Irish media at the moment, good, bad, and indifferent?
Yeah, I find media fascinating, and I find it fascinating, and I'm a massive advocate of professional journalism, and the profession of journalism. It's a very important profession. It's an honourable profession. It is, in my experience in Ireland, it's high quality. Journalists are of high quality. and I think we have a high standard of journalism in this country. In our what I think is sometimes called legacy media or mainstream media. And I don't think I don't accept that social media is media. The clue is in the word, and it's not just objective. Opinions are not media.
Yeah.
So I think it is absolutely essential that we have good media. I am fed up with the bashing of RTE. I had my own experiences, controversies, but I would 100% support RTE, support Kevin Packhurst. I think it's too easy a whinge for politicians to have a go at RTE. And I think it should be supported and it should be respected. And I think that's essential. I think our newspapers are really important. I'm amazed at the recent news. I think it's brilliant news around the Business Post. And I'm not saying that just because of this podcast. The Bonnier takeover, taking the majority stake. I mean, that's brilliant. The Business Post could have gone under, and Endo Quinine deserves massive, massive respect and congratulations for, actually acquiring the Business Post when it could have gone under, finding new investors, bringing that through. I think that is great to see. But, it's the same with the Media House. It's the same with, I actually think the radio stations are really interesting. And then the Irish Times, managing to be independent. And I think the, bar radio stations. So I think you're seeing an interesting thing where you've actually international professional media groups.
That's the big change.
But that's good because it brings in investment. It's like anything in this country. We need capital. We really need capital. We also need expertise. I look at the Dublin City Task Force. The expertise, there's some great expertise in Dublin, but God, you've got to look at the expertise in London. We've got to bring in the best. We've also got to bring in the capital. Why I was keen for Ireland and for Dublin to be at MIPIM, the investment conference. And again, I get fed up with whinging about, they spent X amount on hotel rooms and all that. We've got to get away from that. That's really pathetic stuff. We've got to be serious about our job, about building out this state, building out the Republic. Good media is an essential part about building that out. We need to support RTE. We need to support the private sector media, and we need good media environment. I think we do, but I know from my time in TV3 just the struggles of media in this country are all around the kind of subscale of the country. Now, thankfully, the scale is increasing in the country, and that's helping. I think it's a major driver of our economic growth is the fact that we're getting more people and we are growing, and that's unlike other European countries, and that helps media somewhat.
Yeah.
But and I think also what you're seeing with media is that massive shift from the physical to the digital, whether it's broadcasting into or podcasting or whatever it is, whatever form. I think it is really interesting to see that. And that's, again, moving from a legacy kind of infrastructure into something new. It's not easy to do, but it's been done.
Yeah. I'm conscious we'll finish now, and I'm conscious I'm throwing a lot of jobs at you. But the last time we spoke in a one-on-one, it was in 2019, sitting in the falling down GPO, and we touched on the RTE DG appointment had just happened. You had been overlooked. You didn't even get an interview, which seemed incredible given your history at TV3. You said you were hurt by not getting the interview, whatever about the job, that you weren't considered. The way you've just spoken there is a passionate advocate for public sector broadcasting and for RTE. Genuinely, if there were a board seat or an advisory role or something, I'm not going to ask you about Kevin Backhurst's job because clearly you're not in the mix for that. You don't want an executive job. But if there was a role for you at RTE, would you be interested in it?
You never know. I mean, I think probably not, but because it's a bit too close in some ways. But I think, but I'm committed to, in my own life, I'm committed to largely working in private sector. But I always will have room for one or two public roles. And, I think it's incumbent on all of us, particularly from business, to work in public sector, both because it's really interesting, fascinating, it's a completely different challenge, but also because we all benefit in the private sector from the economy and the growth of the economy. And we all have a job and an obligation to support that. And, we've got to build out this state. We've got to build out our infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure word is used too much. We've got to build out our services, and we've all got to find ways to contribute to that. That sounds worthy. It's actually just more fun. It's really, really, really enjoyable. This country is at a great point. It's a lot of fun working here. And I think it's a great opportunity, whether it's in media, whether it's in logistics, whether it's in whatever area, in a country that's growing as fast as Ireland, the economy as fast as Ireland, and in a world that is as challenged as it is. This is a pretty exciting time.
Seems like we'll be hearing a lot more from you in the next little while. Thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Hey, welcome back. I think that was a fascinating interview. I think it touched on a lot of different topics. But one thing I'd like us to talk about at the start is I think semi-states are actually, the leaders of semi-states anyway, are some of the most interesting business figures in Ireland. Because I think you would rightly roll your eyes if you heard the head of a private corporation talk about building the republic or building out the republic. And it's actually one of the things that he says he doesn't like the word infrastructure. So, this is what we should do. We should be building out services in the republic. But McRedmond can claim that he's done that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he can. I think that is something that, as you say, coming from somebody else would feel pretty trite, but it shines through in a lot of what he's talking about. When we get to the RTE part of the interview, you could hear it as well. There was a passionate defence there. He does care about the state, which sounds like a very obvious thing to say. But in his own role, especially with his role here with An Post and with the task force, of course he has built out services in a way that benefit the wider citizenship, if you want to put it that way. And
they're interesting roles, semi-state leaders as well, because they're part opposition politicians saying we don't want the government to do this, such as the price cap on stamps, as touched on in the interview, the limits on salaries for semi-state leaders. But they also sort of have to be diplomats because they have to say, I'm a custodian of this part of the republic, as he calls it, and I have to ensure that I hand it over, in his case to Fergal Levy, in good stead and with more growth. It's a tricky balancing act, but he does seem to manage it quite well because he's not a figure who's seen as being overly adversarial, but he does seem to have a strong track record of getting stuff done that otherwise may not have been done.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, he mightn't seem that adversarial outwardly, but I think I interviewed him, as we mentioned in the interview, a couple of years ago as well, 6 or 7 years ago. And anytime you're in his company, you do get that sense of he would knock heads together, as we said at the start. Like he definitely has that about him. I think the other interesting part on the semi-state side was he mentioned at least once, if not twice, about how they shouldn't be overtly commercial, which of course is exactly the whole point of a semi-state. But I would think a lot of people running the semi-states, especially coming from a more purely business background, a private sector commercial background, would kind of like to push the envelope on that, of let's make this thing as commercial as possible. And I probably would have thought that of David McRedmond, but he was very much kind of holding true to the ethos of a semi-state, which I thought was interesting.
It is interesting, particularly in the context of the discussion around RTE, because I think one of the main criticisms of RTE is that it's focused too much on its commercial operations at the expense of fulfilling its public service obligations. What do you think he would have done that Kevin Backhurst has or hasn't done?
I think maybe to that exact point, he would have had a clearer view of, it does feel a little bit, and Backhurst has had a lot to do, to be fair to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it does feel like they're a little bit unsure as to just how commercial this organisation is supposed to be. I get the sense that McRedmond has a clearer view of what any semi-state should be. And so I think maybe would have tacked more to one side or the other, and probably more to the semi-state side than trying to, and with that, yes, it's going cap in hand to the government probably for additional funding if you're not going to do so much on the commercial side. But my feeling is that RTE kind of needs to make up its mind which it's going to be. Is it going to be a public service broadcaster in name only and actually be very commercial? Or is it going to forego a lot of the commercial revenue that it could gain in order to be a kind of truer semi-state? McRedmond's view of the world and view of semi-state seems to be that it's more the latter you should go with. And I think that's what he would have done.
He does have that clarity of thought and clarity of vision that I do think would lead to him leading an organisation, as he's done with An Post, like RTE. And you touched on as well the other great semi-state, DAA.
Not interested.
Is not approached, I think, or there's people have mentioned
People had
it
mentioned him, but he hasn't been approached.
That seems like that perhaps he had made his mind up and said, I'm done my, as he says in the interview, I've done my executive work and I'm going to move on. And as he said himself, he needs to, not that he needs to make money, but he has an opportunity now to make money that's probably not available to semi-state chief executives. Surely someone should be sending out David McRedmond about taking over DAA at this stage.
I would think so. And also, I mean, you can only take the man at his word. The man himself said, I don't want another executive job. I don't want to do one of these. But to say that I know more than David McRedmond about his own career, he does have that sense, as we've said, of kind of purpose, vision, mission. He mentioned quite frankly about the pay element at a semi-state. But I kind of thought before doing the interview, I thought he would have been looking for another big exec job if there was one that was appealing enough to him. And DAA seems like it could be appealing enough to him. He said it wasn't, but I would like to test his mettle if I were in the Department of Transport.
It's certainly another opportunity to build out the Republic, to provide extra services for people. He was full of praise for what DAA actually does and probably some insight into him. You can get to your plane and your plane's there quite quickly in Dublin Airport in a way that you perhaps couldn't have in the past. That's the function of the airport, as he says. Everything else is an add-on, and he has experience of those add-ons. We'll just never know, I suppose, although he left the door open to board positions.
I mean, he only has, what did he say? He's got 2 with another one in the works. It would be doable, I think, if he really wanted to.
And if he has the energy to push through the Dublin task force with Robert Watt at his side, or as he says, Robert Watt leading it. He's non-executive. McRedmond's non-executive. That's someone who's not finished, I think, in their service to the state.
Yeah, he doesn't feel like a guy who's been worn down by his stint in the semi-state. He doesn't feel like a guy who's out of energy or out of ideas. Actually, quite the opposite. Which again, just all led me to believe that he would, if there was a good enough CEO job. And he says it himself, I can finally say now I'm actually a good CEO. It took me a while to get there, but he's comfortable in his own shoes. I just get the feeling that he's not done. I feel like he'll wash up somewhere. Like he's got the task force. That is a big job. I'm sure his board positions are very important and, they are quite public facing as well in a way. But I just get the sense we'll see more of him in a more public role again yet.
I get the sense the task force won't be day to day enough. It's big picture, and I hope that they will get the momentum behind it. But can you go from the transformation he's delivered at An Post to hoping that TII will talk to the OPW, to talk to all those things where you're a small cog in amongst a load of smaller cogs trying to turn a big wheel.
Yeah,
it feels like he does have the energy to keep going.
I think so. Like it came across in the interview. He's still very passionate about stuff. Like he's not kind of one of these look for a few handy directorships and kind of trudge along for the next couple of years. Like he still wants to disrupt, might be too strong, but like wants to influence a lot of things was kind of the sense that I got from him. So I suppose he will have that opportunity in the roles he already has. But as we've said a few times now, I just get the sense he might influence something else yet as well.
I expect we'll have David McRedmond back on the business podcast in a year or two talking about some other big transformation. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be out again next week.
Thank you.